dear.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. Today is the first Friday of October, and so that means it is time for NICU Parent Network's Friday feature, Let's Talk About Race. I'm Keira Sorrells, and joined, of course, by my lovely and wonderful co-host, NPN's Board President, Gigi Khonyongwa-Fernandez. Gigi,
Hello.
so good to see you, as always.
Likewise.
So, just a quick recap. We started these conversations in the spring,
Mhm.
and really they started out as you and me just having our own conversations, either kind of NICU Parent Network related, or just kind of personally, just having these really frank, honest, and blame-free discussions about race and racial inequality in the US, and how that manifests in health disparities and racial inequality, specifically in the NICU for people of color. And I'm so glad when you said, you know what, we need to take these outside of our little bubble and bring these out to everybody else to help start these conversations.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm so glad that we've continued to do them. One of the things that we both really hope is that with each episode that we have, that, as you said so beautifully when we were kind of writing up the purpose of this series, that we want to start triggering the wave of positive, sustainable racial change where each individual person is. So
Oh, did I say that? I'm going to
you,
remember
yes, you sure did.
that. Yeah.
Absolutely, you did. So our September episode, we started to talk about biases, right?
Yes.
So we talked about how we all have them. We talked a little bit about microaggressions, implicit and conscious bias, micro incivilities. And I mean, these conversations could go on for hours, but we still have some more work to do when we talk about biases.
Yeah.
So today, we're going to talk about how these biases show up in our organizations, in healthcare. And then we kind of want to get into, what's really important for us when we were talking about doing this series is that we don't just talk, right? But that we actually give some strategies or some takeaways for people to go away and, think about, talk about among themselves,
Mhm.
with their teams, with their communities. So we're going to talk today about how we neutralize and normalize these discussions, and then how to really address biases that show up in your organization. So I don't know if you wanted
Mhm.
to add anything to my
No,
little intro.
no, I think that's perfect, and I think the thing that we keep coming back to is remembering that these discussions are to initiate, facilitate, trigger, whatever you want to call it, conversations, because this is a big elephant and you cannot bite it all off in one time. And I think, for
Right.
you as a leader and also as an organization within your team, recognize that it's a process and recognize that sometimes you may take 3 steps forward and 20 steps backwards, but that's okay because that's a part of the embedding and the learning, and you have to make mistakes.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that I agree totally. And I think last month also, we shared, as one of the takeaways, we shared a link with you to a short video, again, to kind of raise your awareness of what some examples of that implicit bias, microaggressions could look like. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that, go back and look at that. But to your point, Kira, you want to just dive in
Yeah,
for
well, I just, I did want to say just one thing, you know, where you're talking about, it's a process
yeah.
for this to become embedded as a part of your organizational culture, that it's not just, oh, I took a training on implicit bias, so I'm good now, right? Or
Right.
it's not, okay, yeah, it's time to do our yearly training on implicit bias. That's not what we're talking about, because that's where you get into just kind of the tick box, where you go through the motions. Now it may bring some awareness to you.
Mhm.
But as far as, what we're really talking about is true, wanting to create and foster that cultural shift inside your
Definitely.
organizations, right?
Definitely. And those are things that are quite subjective. And that's why it takes so, there's a longevity to it that takes a while. Like you said, it's really easy to collect data. And you can dataized, if that's even a word, yourself to death, and you can have all the numbers. But what do they mean? And so, it's actually good to have numbers so you can kind of, figure out your baseline. But
Sure.
the query to ask yourself is, so what? So what about that? What are we going to do with that? And I think, to your point, how will that impact a meaningful change? And what I always like to encourage people to do, like if you were to scale yourself, I mean, this is one of the strategies, but we can throw it in now, is when you do those baseline checks, whatever they may be, is, on a scale of 1 to 10. And, the query you ask yourself is not, how do I get from 2 to 10, or from 5 to 10, is how do I get from 2 to 2.5? What do we need to do? What are those small incremental but crucial changes we need to make? I need to make them myself as a leader.
Right.
And those changes could be awareness, could be reflection, could be actual tangible things, whatever. But it's those small things, because those are the things, like you mentioned, about that's going to create that cultural shift. And they will begin to feed into like your policies, your processes, your systems, etc.
Right.
And so sometimes, one of the reasons, people with this whole topic, you kind of burn out quite quickly, is because we have tried to do too much too little, and we haven't done some of that work. What is it? Introspective, reflective work. Yeah, that is essential, particularly when you're talking about biases, because when we talk about bias, we often are saying unconscious or implicit bias. So it's those things that are, quick thinking. You don't even think about it. Actually,
Right.
you just act on it, and so that's why it's so important to pause before you jump.
Yes. Well, something that you've always said to me is, the power in the pause. And that
Yeah.
is yeah, that is true in so many situations, and certainly for this as well. So let's jump in. So
Yes.
let's talk about how biases show up in
Mhm.
your organization in healthcare. Like you mentioned the little video clip that we shared last month, which is really kind of a tiny little example of how that might show up in an office setting. But how, tell us more.
Yeah, yeah. How long is a piece of string? But there's so much. But I think, one of the things to kind of quickly take one step back before we jump into that is,
Sure.
again, remembering that when we talk about bias, it's really your preference that you have, a preference or inclination, which that in itself is not bad, but when it begins to inhibit impartiality. So when it prevents you from treating everyone equally. And so thinking about in that is when you begin to process information about individuals quite quickly before you even know them. So what they're dressed like, their size, their ethnicity, their age, if they have different abilities, whatever it may be, and you start linking that to your supposed knowledge of that person, or a category of people that you kind of put in. So keeping that in the backdrop when we're talking about this, as a kind of thing to go back to would be really helpful. So we all as individuals have a tendency to gravitate towards those people, people that are similar to us, because it helps us. It kind of, helps us to feel good about ourselves. But the danger is they become our in-group, and we only stay within our in-group. And so some examples of how that could show up, there are a multitude of examples, but I wanted to just pull one from each one.
Yeah.
And you can kind of add to all of this, maybe things that you've seen, or you've heard of, you've lived, etc. But as a leader, one of the things where bias shows up a lot is in your recruitment practices. So who do you hire? Who do you even consider hiring? Who do you, all these things. Do you only hire people who look like you or think like you or behave like you? So do you only hire your in-group?
That is so interesting. That was something I remember when we were doing the interviews for our new board members, and Thais Leverett, who's one of our wonderful new members, works with Stellantis, which used to be Chrysler. And that was one of the things that she talked about as, leading their DE&I efforts was, they always would go to a college fair at a, huge university, right? But she said, there are so many technical schools out there with really capable, really, smart and hardworking students. Why aren't we going there? And that's, that's kind of an example, I think, in the, in the corporate world, right?
Definitely. And it happens, in hospitals, it happens in schools, it happens everywhere. And so some organizations are going increasingly toward what they call blind recruitment. So trying to remove anything that could remotely, it's difficult to do, but anything that, name, where they, gender, where they, where their location, kind of try to remove, because remember the bias is those quick thinking things. Oh, that person goes to whatever. And even bias can be positive bias, or they label it positive bias, but it's not really, because you're still categorizing somebody. Oh, that person went to Harvard, so therefore they must be whatever. So when you're recruiting as a leader, you could, and there are lots of ways of how you can do blind recruitment. And it just basically just means you are trying to, as much as possible, eliminate anything that would trigger your biased behavior, and that you're kind of putting that person in a category before you even show up. You don't even know anything about them. And that kind of has an historical context, because particularly in corporate America, they were renowned for not hiring people who had what they considered a Black name, an Indian name, Asian name, whatever. And so they didn't even get the cut. So it doesn't matter, where whether you were capable or not, you didn't even have the opportunity. I mean, that door was totally locked, closed, bolted, and so as a leader, I would just ask, encourage you to ask, how do you recruit? And you may be having some biased behavior within that unknowingly, because you're gravitating, like you said, Keira, gravitating to a certain group of people, a certain hospital, a certain, area. I mean, whatever. And so just having to think about that would be a good sort of thing to do as a leader.
Yeah, and that's not just true in hiring, but what about your volunteers?
Exactly.
Board members, your speakers for your events and things like that. I mean, it kind of shows up not just in the kind of staffing model, I think.
Yes, and that's a really good point. And when I say recruitment, I'm talking about partnerships as well, and however they show up. But you're right. It's like, who am I gravitating towards? For to be the face, or to be the face of my organization, or to be seen as partners of my organization, whether that be volunteers or whatever. So you're spot on. That is correct. And that kind of is a really good segue into how biased behavior can show up as a team. And it is about, who do you tend to work with, externally, but also within your team, who tends to always want to work together. And that kind of always that pairing, or, the groups of people that always come together. And, they could be looked at as cliques, but also it could be looked at, you need to sort of reflect and see, are only a certain group of people working on this all the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think about, different, different initiatives that we've been a part of on, various topics. And it's like, if it's this specific topic, we know, these 5 people are going to be on that task force. If it's this topic, and I'm talking about, collaborations that we do outside of NPN.
Okay.
If it's this disease area, we know who's going to be on that task force, because it does just kind of tend to repeat. So it's it's something certainly to be aware of and cognizant of, that, don't just always go to, oh yeah, you know, Alice, she's great at that. Let's just bring
Mhm.
her in.
Right,
Let's say,
right.
who else do we know?
Exactly.
Where else might we look? Alice is wonderful. Nothing against Alice, right? But
Yes,
who else is out there? And where
exactly.
might we go to look for someone, to look for an expert?
Right,
There's
right.
one
Yeah,
thing,
because it's Alice and, or
right?
it could be Alice or, it does, and that's the thing, is like if you're just going to working with who you know only, then like Thais, you mentioned Thais, is like you've missing out a whole potential
Mhm.
pool of people,
Right.
um, just because you're kind of having a linear sort of
Yeah.
mindset. I
But
cut you off, sorry, what were you saying?
oh, I was just thinking, another question, or another kind of point popped into my mind in a conversation that we had with Kimberly Novad, who is
Mm,
one of our members and the founder of Saul's Light,
yeah,
down in
amazing.
New Orleans.
Mhm.
And, one of the things that she said is, don't always ask Black people to talk about Black things.
Amen.
No more than just about Black people. you know, and I was like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. Of
Yeah,
course.
yeah. But that is a very good example of positive bias.
Mm,
Or even you saying that people who are of Asian descent, people just assume they know everything about technology. For example, I'm going to go to them because they know that.
right.
Um, and you can kind of get into this. It becomes knowledge fatigue,
Mhm.
and also it becomes like it's a form of tokenism as
Mm,
well, because if you didn't have that person, where else would you go?
right.
You would. So it's not necessarily, I wouldn't, and it gets into business relationship and et cetera, those kinds of things. It's okay to go to those people, but I think if you're only going to those people
Right.
for the information, so it's like, what else are you doing? Like what you said about the team, who else are we going out to
Mhm.
speak for us or to work with us on this project, et cetera? So
Right.
widening out your field would be,
Mhm.
is a big part of it. And that's actually kind of taps into one of the strategies I was going to talk about. Um, so as a leader and as a team, but then also as an organization, one of the ways that bias behavior shows up is through your training and development and your promotion.
Mm, mhm.
And they kind of link in together. And again, that could be with your volunteers, that can be with, um, with who you put out for your speakers, et cetera. And so the query to ask, and it comes up a lot in organizations, is, who tends to get the opportunities
Mm,
for attending trainings, for attending seminars, for attending
mhm.
webinars,
Mhm.
for making that initial connection, whatever it is. Because that oftentimes is directly related to who gets promoted, who
Mm,
gets more opportunities, who gets, you know, more chances, whatever you may call it,
right.
who's likely to mostly get promoted. And with organizations, that comes up a lot because you tend to have various levels of training and different types of training, et cetera. And who are you encouraging? Oh, hey, that's happening, or this happening. Are you encouraging? Is your organization, sorry, encouraging it within a very neutral and non-biased and impartial way,
Right.
or not?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And in healthcare, oh, there's so many,
Mhm.
so many examples in healthcare. But one that we've talked about in different forms, but I think one that I don't hear so much about, but I am a former healthcare worker, so my background is healthcare, and I worked um, in hospitals and rehab centers and different types of healthcare settings, both in the U.S. and here in the U.K. But one thing that comes out that I've seen time and time again is record keeping
Hmm.
in healthcare. And that the records, your medical records, are a legal document, and they are also essential to what people know about you. So when you're doing handover, we
Mm,
know when they're right, whatever it is.
yeah.
And that's why to the um to the disappointment, or I guess, or of some of my colleagues, not everyone, but some people did not like me saying this, but I would tell my families and my clients that read your records, ask for your records. You have a right to read what's being said about you.
Right.
Because we used to have to write in what's called SOAP note format. So SOAP. So S is subjective, O is objective, A is assessment, P is plan.
Mm-hmm.
And that subjective part was full of bias concepts and understandings and behaviors.
Give us an example.
So an example would be if you were working with someone of Asian descent, it would be written in there, very quiet, not answering my queries, very subservient patient.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And without even understanding, that we were kind of looking at it from a very Western standpoint. Or they would write teen mother.
Mm-hmm.
Teen mother probably doesn't have a good support system.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that.
Yeah.
Or so it's and then you would ask, well, how do you know they don't have a support system? Or how do you know, but then there was no evidence to show that. It was just that subjective part of who they were would come into how they would write about that person.
Interesting.
And it's incredibly important to read that, because you can challenge that. If you don't know. So another example that comes up a lot that happens with record keeping is what was I going to say? Oh yeah, with medication.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes if they don't feel like, so with a lot of Black and brown populations, they feel like they have less education. So they will almost dumb down the records. If that's a bad way of saying it, but it will be very basic information, and it would say things like provided simple instructions to help understanding. And so that's you see what I'm saying. So it would come out like that. So it was not that blatant, like, I don't think this person knows what I'm talking about. But it would be in words like simple understanding, broke it down into one step or two steps. And then when you start checking that, well, why? Because what happens with that when it comes to the bias, then sometimes the information that's required, essential information that's required, is not given.
Right. Well, and I think you make a good point too when you mentioned about like handover. When you're giving report to the next person, then it's implanting that expectation in that next caregivers or that next clinical professional's mind. So before they've even laid eyes or had a conversation with the patient, they've already got something fixed in their brain about what this person is going to be like, how they need to treat them. And like you said, it may not be based on fact.
Exactly. And that's the key. It's most times it's not. If you have a family, a NICU family who is quite proactive, they ask a lot of queries in there because they're trying to understand.
Right.
They will be described as difficult.
Yes.
Very difficult, doesn't understand what we're trying to tell them, and is, or they have their own way. And so that's why it's so important for, one of the ways as an organization, as a leader, you can encourage, because everyone has a right to read their medical records. It's about you. It's a legal document. You just ask to see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What are they writing about your child? So as a parent, so it's that, but biased behavior show up and that's across healthcare, almost every healthcare setting that I've been a part of.
And we see how easy it is to perpetuate, from clinician to
clinician, because there's a trust there. So if you are a nurse telling another nurse, your colleague, then they're going to trust you a whole lot more. You're then if they trust the family and says, actually, no, I didn't say that. I didn't say it like that, or it was a different context. And so you're right. You're perpetuating the myth, perpetuating the lie. And so that's really important. And I think one of the, we talked about, how do you start talking about it?
Right. Yeah.
How do you start dealing with that? And I think it sounds really, really simple, but it's so incredibly important is to have those open communications.
Mm-hmm.
And one way of doing that is begin to ask for other people's opinions.
Okay.
I've noticed this, is it just me or am I seeing that? And not just your in group,
Mm-hmm.
people who are outside of your group as well.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and actually listen to what they're saying.
Mm-hmm. When we were kind of planning, doing our pre-planning for this discussion, we talked about how, a lot of people just automatically put up defenses. Oh no, I'm not biased. I'm not prejudiced. I'm not racist. And
I have a Black friend.
I love Black people.
I know Black people. I know Asian people. I know whatever. So
Yes.
I can't be biased.
Yes, my best friend is gay.
Yeah, exactly.
It's there's a lot of that, and these conversations can be exceedingly uncomfortable for some people, and we talk about getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. Some people are not. Some people may get very aggressive and defensive, and these conversations can become very volatile, as we see out in the world and across the news. How do we do that? How do we have these conversations in a really constructive way, as you said, to kind of neutralize and normalize these types of conversations? How do we do that and still respect the lens of all sides?
Yeah. I think one of the ways, there are many ways. Well, I guess one that comes to my mind is really about looking at different perspectives, and in a way you can do that is share moments when you felt othered, when you felt judged, when you felt excluded, because we all have had those moments.
Right.
And you may not be a part of a marginalized group, but there are there are shared human experiences that we've all felt. And so, that is one way to begin to neutralize it, because then you're like, oh, I didn't like it when someone made this assumption about me,
Right.
because I was a female, because I did this, or because I said that. And so that's a really powerful way of beginning to have the conversations to where they're much more open and much more positive and much more and safer.
Yes.
Is you begin to share moments of similarities versus moments of dissimilarities.
Yeah.
Share moments where your experiences have been similar. Does that make sense?
Oh, it absolutely does. And, one of the things that I also kind of reflect on is when we first started NICU Parent Network back, 10 years ago, when it was Premium Parent Alliance. And one of the whole reasons that we came together was to bring the NICU parent voice to the table with physicians and researchers, because we saw all this work being done for parents, or, either their baby was going to be affected by the care guidelines, they were going to be affected by the education that was being developed, and yet the parents weren't involved in the development of those things. And so I think about it in that kind of analogous way, that we have a certain experience that can't be taught in medical school.
Exactly.
And so let me work with you. Let me help you do your job even better. We're not we didn't come at it saying, this is everything you're doing wrong. We looked at it as, okay, these are some examples of what can happen. This is how a parent may interpret it. Let's consider this as an alternative in communicating with parents. And I think, it's similar with, lived experience from any lens, as, a gay couple in the NICU, as a Black family in the NICU, as an Asian family in the NICU. Each marginalized community have, very unique and specific lived experiences. And, we can only do our jobs better by understanding that perspective.
Right. Yeah. I'm trying to turn this off. Sorry. Yeah, you're right. And I think, and that's, and using that, that's why it's important to, to bring in what everyone has felt a little bit of that. It may not be the exact same, because when
Right.
you're talking about marginalized groups,
Right.
it's behavior, but it's also systems that are playing against them, et cetera. But there is something where we have all, I'm just trying to, that's my child, sorry, I'm trying to get him to not call me. So sorry about that. But we all have had experiences where we have felt uncomfortable, where we have felt excluded, and I think that's where you start. When
Yeah.
you said your query was, how do you start those conversations? How do you begin to have those open communications? Is ask queries, be curious about people,
Yeah.
curious in a very positive way,
Mhm.
and also share, and not to compare. There's no comparison about my experiences with yours, but it is about, I kind of get that.
Yeah.
I can get that. I don't get the full, I'm not in the full context, but I can kind of get how that would feel like crap. That wouldn't feel
Yeah.
good.
Right. But and something that you've said, and I've heard, our friend Janae Johns also say is
Mhm.
believe them when they
Yes,
tell you their experience. Believe them.
yes,
That
because
was
you would want to be
really
believed.
powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, if you shared something that was quite impactful to you, you would want, or traumatic to you, you would want to be believed.
Hmm. Right.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. And so I just love talking to you because there's so many things that pops out, but I'm always sort of mindful of time.
Good.
But I think, one, I had a couple, but actually I'm gonna just hold on this one as far as a strategy. One big sort of way that everybody in the audience that can go and take away and start doing, and it can help you as a leader, it can help your team, and also help your organization, to begin to start addressing bias. And I say begin because it goes back to, remember, it's a process. So it's something that you can begin to start doing. This exercise called My Trusted 10. And I guess we can put it up. I can send the link for it. And basically it's an interactive exercise that you can do it. You can modify it accordingly to, who you're working with. And it's really a way to kind of begin to shine a light into your biases, and particularly your unconscious biases, and kind of make it even more visible to you about how you're showing up, how you're, being present, both socially, professionally, etc. And so all you do is you think about 10 people in your sort of trusted circle of friends. So don't think about your partner or your family members. They have to be excluded for this one. um, but think about 10 people in your kind of trusted circle of friends outside of those people, those outliers I said. And then the second step is to think about their characteristics, things about them. So their gender, their race, their sexual orientation, their faith, socioeconomic status, disability, etc. And jot that down. So jot down your 10 trusted people, jot down what it is about them. And then the last part is, the third part, sorry, is thinking about that list that you just jotted down, those 10 people. Begin to ask yourself a query, going back to what we talked about earlier, the in group. Are those people around you very similar or dissimilar to you? Do you have more people that are in your in group versus your out group? And if you do, the last part, and it's probably the more challenging part, is, as a leader and as a team, again, thinking about what is the one thing we can do or you can do to make your trusted circle dissimilar. Now that can be very uncomfortable because it's like, well, I don't want to have somebody that's not like me. But it is a challenge, but it's a gentle challenge to think about. If I'm only like what we, to kind of summarize what we've been talking about, if I'm only going to these people, if I'm only going to this organization, if I'm only working with this, partner, what about if I go to that person, that's in a totally different group than me, totally different belief system than I have, totally different, whatever, and reach out. And, I've done this exercise with different people and different leaders and also organizations, and it has been incredibly powerful. partly to just recognize who's your in group, and because we don't actually take the time to pause and see who do we kind of swim around in the same ocean with. And then the other big part is, let me actually start intentionally, actively reaching out to just one other person, or one other group, or one other hospital, or one other whatever that's different than me, or they do things in a different way than I do.
Just realized I had muted myself.
Oh, I was
gonna say, three-year-old toddler running around in the background. So
okay.
Well, I love that's a very tangible exercise, something that could, be done during, a staff meeting, during volunteer training, during a board meeting, something to really, like you said, kind of begin to neutralize and normalize those discussions. I love that. And
and you can grade it. If 10 feels too big, break it down to 2 or to 5 or to 3, so you can grade up. You don't have to, again, bite off the whole elephant in one go. But you're right. You can look at it as a leader. You can look at it as your team. You can look at it as your board, as your organization, and just begin to identify who's your in group, and then who in the out group. I'm sort of using those terms loosely. Can you begin to engage with?
Yeah. Well, I love that. And I think that is a perfect way to end today's segment. We try so hard to make these 20 minutes. They're never 20 minutes.
You just got to say, just throw it out the window, just say half an hour. They're closer to half an hour than 20 minutes.
Exactly. But well, I appreciate, as always, Gigi, the wisdom that you share with us and the tangible takeaways that you share with us. I hope that everybody, as you watch this recording, you'll, put some comments on the video so that we can learn more about what you're doing and, how you're beginning to address racism, bias in your organizations. Maybe it's self-reflection. However, you're taking the information that we're sharing in these conversations. So, Gigi, thank you so much, as always.
Thank you so much for having this space to actually have these discussions.
Absolutely. It's, it's really important. It's important work that you're doing. It's important work that we're doing together for NPN. And I hope it does cause those, that ripple effect
definitely
throughout our community. So everybody have a beautiful, wonderful weekend. And we will be back next Friday with an NPN Friday Feature Member Highlight. And then, of course, next month, the first Friday in November, Gigi and I will be back to keep talking about race. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.